Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danielle Nierenberg. This week, we're celebrating the lead up to Earth Day on Thursday with a series of discussions with chefs from around the world, chefs and other experts from around the world, to talk about the importance of culturally appropriate diets that are good for people and the planet, and that really respect generations of knowledge by farmers, cooks, and communities. These discussions are building on the recently released One Health approach to food, the double pyramid, connecting food, culture, health, and climate from the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition Foundation. And we hope you'll use the hashtag double pyramid and look for previous discussions on foodtank.com. The Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition's health and diet pyramids work to appreciate and honor the richness of culinary and dietary traditions and diversity across the globe. The center has created 7 cultural pyramids that focus on different regions of the world, highlighting the incredible diversity of what sustainable and healthy diets can look like. Yesterday, we spoke to chefs from South and East Asia, and today we're talking to chefs and other experts from Latin America and the United States. It's my pleasure to introduce these panelists. I'll start with Vincent Medina, who is a member and consul person of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, as well as a co-founder of amham Cafe Ohlone in Berkeley, California. I apologize if I mispronounced any of that, Vincent. You can correct me later. The cafe is a seasonal restaurant and cultural space that works to revive Ohlone food traditions as a means of decolonization. He also serves on the board of directors and advocates for Indigenous California language survival, and he is a member of Slow Foods Turtle Island and is a host of the Indigenous News podcast / radio show Bay Native Circle. Next, we have Valerie Segrest, who is an ethnobotanist, activist, and community organizer. She's an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe. She is also the Native American Agriculture Fund's regional director, specializing in Native food and knowledge systems, and the director and founder of the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project. She has co-authored several books, including Feeding the People, Feeding the Spirit, Revitalizing Northwest Coastal Indian Food Culture, and Feeding 7 Generations of Salish. We have Tejerina, who is the chef and co-founder with her sister Raquel of Catalino Cocina Sincera, or Sincere Kitchen, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She has grown the restaurant into a shining example of how to incorporate food sovereignty principles into the restaurant industry. She also exclusively serves seasonal ingredients from agroecological producers. And the restaurant talks about where the food comes from and who grew that food with their clientele. They also promote the consumption of wild game and lesser used cuts of meat while ensuring traceability of all animal products. Thank you all for joining me today. It's such an honor and a pleasure to have you. So I just want to start maybe with, if you could all say a little bit more about yourselves and give our listeners and our viewers a sense of what I didn't include in your bios, if there's, anything that you'd like to add. So Vincent, maybe I'll start with you.
Absolutely. I'd like to start off by saying to all of you, good morning to you all in Chocheño, which is the indigenous language of here in the East Bay, in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. My name is Vincent Medina, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. I'd like to also acknowledge it's very early here in California, so excuse my screen if it's a little bit dark. The sun hasn't risen yet here at home. I'm very happy to be able to represent our culture on this platform and on this global scale through communities that are doing like work around the world on an international level. And one thing that was close to our hearts, of course, when we created this organization, amham, which means our food, in September of 2017, we created this organization because we saw the success of the healing that was happening within our culture led by our elders, to see old wounds be able to be healed, and also the continuity that's been carried on for generations in our community, those things being able to grow stronger and passed on intergenerationally. We created amham because we wanted to be able to tie in the ongoing success of our language revival, land stewardship practices, storytelling revival, the strengthening of a traditional religion, and tie that into our food traditions growing stronger as well, gathering practices renewed, as well as making these foods, which as an urban community here in the San Francisco Bay Area are sometimes inaccessible, making those foods more accessible to our tribal community. Also, our secondary goal of this work has always been to teach the public here in the Bay Area, which is a very urban space that has 7 million people, to teach them that our community, which we're an extreme minority here in our homeland, there's about 1,000 East Bay Ohlone people that are alive in the entire world today, to teach them about how beautiful our culture is, how this area has always been an indigenous place, how this space has never been a new world, but that this place is old. It has its own way of doing things, its own culinary traditions, its own language, and in our case here in California, multiple languages that are represented. And we want people to know the sophistication, the dignity, the power, the beauty of our traditional culture, and to teach them that this is all relevant, valuable, and alive today. And we believe that when people know those facts, they respect us in a different way. They're less likely to desecrate the things that we hold dear. They're less likely to remove our ancestors from their cemeteries for short-term development, more likely to respect us as a living community of indigenous people right here. So this work with amham and Cafe Ohlone, it's centered on justice for our family. And I just like to acknowledge that it's led by our elders who make this possible for us.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love what you had to say about sophistication and dignity. That's such an important part of all this. Valerie, can I turn to you now?
Sure. Good morning. I'm also with Vincent on the early side of the planet this morning. My name is Valerie Segrest. I'm a member of the Muckleshoot tribe, which is located just south of Seattle, Washington. And I went to school to study nutrition. So my degree is in nutrition and clinical herbal medicine. And I remember studying, thinking I couldn't return to my community and be the kind of nutritionist that sat behind a desk and let people be counseled on a diet that I knew very well they didn't have access to, because all roads always led back to healing that can happen, powerful healing that happens when we are consuming more of our traditional foods and medicines. And so I sort of dedicated my whole practice to community nutrition and organizing folks through the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project to learn more about our traditional foods and gain more access to it and identify spaces where we could grow more of our foods. And that has led to several sets of curriculum and more culturally relevant nutrient guidelines. I've been talking about this for over a decade, and I'm really excited to see the pyramids and things that are coming out now. And so that's a little bit more about what I've done just in my personal practice. And now I work as this regional director for the Native American Agriculture Fund, which is charged to stand up and help support Native American agriculture, farmers, ranchers, fishermen, anyone who's trying to start a food business. We fund CDFIs, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and tribal governments. And I'm so proud to be working alongside a crew of people who take this work very seriously. Every single day, we're just beads of blood are dripping from our forehead to make sure we solve all the problems necessary to be able to make a change, because we know that the answers are in Native American food systems. And so we want to be able to help support that in any way possible. And thank you so much for having me and creating this space for us to share. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you all. Before I turn to Mariana, I'd like to thank her translator, Daniela, for being with us as well. So if Mariana could say a little bit more about the work she does, Daniela, that would be wonderful.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. A todos, gracias por la invitación. Gracias por dejar participar también a Daniela, que es parte del equipo de Catalino.
She said thanks for having us in the broadcast. She also introduced me, and I'm part of Catalino's team as well.
Yo hace 20 años, relativamente más o menos, soy cocinera. Y hace unos 5 o 6 empecé a hacerme preguntas junto con mi hermana Raquel sobre la alimentación y más yo que soy cocinera sobre los sabores.
I've been a chef for 20 years now, and for the last 6 years, me and my sister Raquel, we've been wondering about food content and the importance of the origin of food.
Investigando, ¿no? Porque pasaba que cambiaban sabores a la hora de cocinar, empezando a investigar más al alimento, llegamos a la agroecología, que es lo que hacemos en el restaurante, y ahí cambió mi forma ante la mirada gastronómica, ante la gastronomía y mi forma de cocinar y de actuar con el mundo y con el medio ambiente.
So for me, at a point, it was important to see the changes of the taste of the food. So I started inquiring about how food had different tastes, and I started investigating about agroecology, and finally, that's what led us to have like this place that we have right now, based on agroecology.
Y ahí como que volví a empezar de nuevo una nueva gastronomía, que es el futuro, junto a la Facultad Nacional de Buenos Aires, la UBA. Ellos nos ayudaron a armar el restaurante y a entender un poco más la problemática ambiental y alimenticia del mundo y de Argentina.
As a chef, I had to start all over again for a different point of view. And I started studying in the agronomy university, and that the academic area helped us to build the restaurant, to start like having new ways of seeing gastronomy as well.
Bueno, gracias por dejarme participar y por este medio también dar a conocer lo que hacemos en Catalino y cómo afecta este restaurante en la gastronomía argentina y mundial.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for giving us a space to share what Catalino does and how it impacts on gastronomy at the national and international level.
Gracias to you both. This is wonderful, and I love the connection between agroecology and gastronomy. We certainly need more of that. So I just want to start with a sort of a big question for you all, and I think one of the sort of powers or biggest strengths of the double pyramid perspective is that it really pushes all of us to consider and put into focus how our own health is connected to the health of the environment. And I think that's certainly something that we have seen over the last year and a half with the pandemic. But I think it's also something that we've forgotten. Native cultures haven't, and the rest of us have had to be reminded. Can you all speak to why we've forgotten how inextricably linked we are to the health of the planet? Maybe Valerie, you can go first.
I think it starts with what we choose to eat and how we choose to eat it, to be honest. And it's why food has always been really exciting for me. People often ask, like, why did you go to study nutrition? And I'd say it's because I was hungry. Like I got hungry one day, and then all these other questions started happening. Like, why is food so mysterious here in our supermarkets? And what would my ancestors recognize as food walking through the grocery store? And so having some of these discussions with my elders, I started noticing these principles that were arising across so many different village sites and in our area, and they are just as applicable today as they are generations ago. That our ancestors would eat with the seasons, and we would eat local foods. There was also trade routes that happened, but mostly it was, taking care of what was going on right outside your door. And that those foods are not just resources to be extracted from the land. We view them as our relatives, as our greatest teachers that show up in our life and without a spoken word are able to teach us how we're supposed to be in the world. And that requires a lot more attention and focus on our everyday food decisions, which, in a standard American diet or even modern lifestyle, we're just sort of rushing through, having a very transactional experience in our day. Even when we go to the grocery store, it's sort of like this person is handing you a blueberry and you're giving them money and you walk out the door, and it's very transactional, versus if you were to organize your life around huckleberry, which is a close cousin of blueberries that are sort of the royal food of our region. It's like our cultural pride food here in the Northwest. And if you were to go harvest them and bring them back and share them with your community, it requires a lot more active citizenship and more of a transformational instead of transactional experience with food. And I think that helps people to shift paradigms to think about food in a different way entirely. And for cultures who have organized their lives around food for thousands of years, I think we have a lot of insights to share on how we can start doing that, because it may seem really distant and hard to attain, but it's not. We can start putting those into our everyday practices one step at a time.
I love that idea of active citizenship around food. That's a really wonderful idea. Vincent, would you like to comment as well?
Absolutely. So this the separation between traditional food cycles and gathering practices, as well as this commodification of food of where we're at today, for us, I believe that where this stems from is colonization and these efforts to separate us from our traditional food and also separate us from our traditional land practices. An example of this here in California, here in my home, where my family is indigenous to, is in the 1850s here in the state of California. There was a law that was passed that not only legalized genocide against our community, but it also banned our controlled burns. And our controlled burns are here in California, this part of California. There are land stewardship practices that would allow further abundance because it would aerate the soil, it would enrich and add nutrients into the soil through those burns, and also strengthen interconnected plant communities to grow even stronger. Our ancestors would have these controlled burns regularly, and it would allow abundance of all kinds. There was always a backup food as well in the traditional culture that we have, where if we couldn't find, for an example, black oak acorn, we could go to valley oak acorn. If acorn wasn't available, there was buckeye, which might take more work, but still something that has full of nutrients and protein. Now, when those controlled burns were banned, as well as the violence and discrimination and hardships our community faced, it became harder and harder for our family to have access to these traditional foods. And with this rhythm of seasonality, as was just being discussed by Valerie, this seasonality is it's ingrained in our culture as well here in California. And an example of this is right now in springtime. We call the season Huyukne Tioshiwarep, which means the earth has begun to blossom on us, as all of these greens are coming up right now that are so cleansing to our bodies after we just left this heavier time of winter where we're eating heavier foods and eating more smoked meats traditionally, eating foods that are more dense in calories. And that goes into this time of springtime where all these greens are coming up. They're so purifying for our bodies. That goes into summertime where these nutrient, sugar-rich berries start to come up, like our native blackberries, our California strawberries, our thimbleberries and salmon berries, and also those nuts that are also nutrient-rich. That goes into fall time of our acorn harvesting time, which is such a community gathering time where you can't just go and gather acorns on your own, but you have to have your community that's doing that with you in order to have enough for the year and create granaries that would last for even 3 years is how we gather them nowadays. But in the old days, it would be at least 7, which goes back into wintertime. But understanding the seasonality and rhythm, and also the personhood of plants is how we see them. It's not just being these plants that you could just pull from the ground and extract, but understanding that everything has a relationship to one another. And we see this personhood as being something that needs to be respected, acknowledged, and that happens to us in the form of prayer and also interconnectedness between all life that's there in our home.
What a beautiful sentiment, the personhood of plants. I love that. And also what you had to say about backup foods and the resilience that really creates. And so when that's taken away, you're taking away a lot of people's power. Mariana, do you want to comment as well on this idea of how we become separated from, you know, how our health and the environment are connected? You're on mute.
Nosotros desde Catalino y desde mi experiencia gastronómica, la alimentación que tenemos, que hacemos en Catalino, va a favor del medio ambiente y ante una dieta saludable. Ya sea, nosotros hacemos un consumo de estación.
So from Catalino, what we try to introduce to the community is the importance of having a diet that is healthy and that has the lowest impact on the planet.
Bueno, ya sea la alimentación, trabajar sin agroquímicos y con productores directos y con las cosas locales. Y también cuando yo creo los platos, son sabores simples, con productos simples y que sean de cercanía. Todo esto reúne a que por decantación hacemos una dieta saludable, no solo para nosotros, sino también para el planeta.
So we try the things that we produce in the restaurant to come back to the basics, food that it's not doesn't have any poison or agrotoxics or things that we produce that are as simple as possible, like coming back to the basics, coming back to the very basic of the food. And so that we think that it would lead us to a better impact on the planet. It's very important for us to communicate that to the people who come here, because, and I'm going to add this particularly, people, when it comes here, they'll think they will eat food that is overproduced or overprocessed. And for us, it's important to show people that in order to have less impact, it's important to come back to the basics, to eat the simple things. And they're super tasty too. That's, for us, it's important to show to the people that come to Catalino.
That's wonderful. So on that point, if we can stay with Chef Mariana for a minute, I'd like to bring up the cultural pyramid for Latin America, if possible. So Chef Mariana and Daniela, this, is the cultural pyramid that the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition Foundation developed for Latin America. And I'm wondering, Mariana, you said in an interview that I don't use game meat out of snobbery, but out of conviction. I do not have deer on the menu because it is fashionable. I have it because it is what you have to eat. And so, when we're looking at a cultural pyramid, often meat is sort of vilified or thought of as something very bad. But in a lot of cultures, it provides not only a source of important nutrition, but it's also very sustainable. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the importance of meat in the Latin American diet and why it's sustainable. Does that make sense, Daniela?
Yes.
Nosotros desde Catalino, y también son elecciones al usar, cuando dejamos de usar carne vacuna, ¿no? Y también bajar un poco el consumo de lo que es la carne. Digo, la Argentina no solamente produce ganado, si bien hay también muchos legumbres y cereales, pero que está en la pirámide, pero acá no hay una buena distribución del alimento.
So first to start, it's very complex, the distribution of the food in our country. So our the main production for us, it used to be like meat and raw food for exportation and some other cereals. There was at a point a variety of different cereals, but now it's mainly meat and soy. So here in Catalino, what we try to introduce is a different kind of consuming. Like, it's, as you said, like, it's not that we use deer because it's a fashion or it's trending. We use it because it's sustainable. Because if we produce a bunch of meat from cows, and we introduce it in our diets, we have to start changing that because it's a big impact for our country and for the distribution as well.
Por eso, como bien vos decías, no es moda, no es por medio de una moda de que uso ciervo ni jabalí, sino porque son dos animales que fueron introducidos, entonces no tienen depredador. Y como no hay un depredador, la naturaleza y el medio ambiente se altera. Entonces, ¿quién tiene que ser ese depredador? Los seres humanos. Nosotros desde Catalino elegimos esas carnes que son más sustentables para el medio ambiente.
So as you said, we're not using deer as fashion or something trendy or something that it's tasty. We use it because we need to control the population, because the deer and the wild pig that we use as well here, those were species that were introduced in the area, and we need to control it, not to make a balance in the ambience. So it's important for us to when we serve a dish and we would think about it to introduce a certain dish to our menu, to introduce it with making conscious around it, like thinking why we are eating deer and we're not eating cow. We're eating deer because we need to control the population that it's being introduced by human beings too.
Fantastic. I love that you talk about this balance in the environment, and that's such a wonderful and delicious way to do it. Thank you. Valerie, if we can turn back to you, I know that you have developed your own sort of native dietary guidelines poster, and I'm wondering if you could share it on the screen, because meat is a very important part of that as well, smoked meats and preserving meats.
Yeah, I'm going to try to pull it up right now. It's just a simple PDF. Can you see that? Did I do it?
Great. So
Yay.
beautiful.
So this is we've called them the traditional foods principles, and it's a poster that's developed for classroom settings or anywhere really. But it's about just the common themes that were rising from all these conversations with all these Native communities across the country that, like I said, they're just as applicable today as they were generations ago. Living with the seasons, that is something that Vincent was talking about as well, that it is part of what attunes us to the world that we're living in, our direct environment, and that we are receiving food at their peak nutrients. I think about how they get us in rhythm and sort of, support us with what we need at the time. I mean, during flu season, there seems to be this abundance of foods that are rich in vitamin C in my region. Like, that makes sense. They're helping to build our immune systems and keep us strong and offer us that stamina we need to get through the season. To also diversify your diet. The standard American diet, where Americans eat an average between 12 and 20 different foods on an annual basis. That's very different from my Coast Salish ancestors who had over 100 or 300 different kinds of foods in 1 year from just a 100-mile radius from Whitecap to Whitecap. We call it the Salish Sea or the Puget Sound to the top of Mount Rainier. To eat more plants. I think that's the thing. That's one of these things that all nutritionists can agree on, that we can all just eat more plants, and that traditional foods are whole foods. They're not, you don't need a scientific degree to understand what's in them. You know, a blueberry is a blueberry. It's itself. It's so simple. And to gather wild foods with somebody who's very knowledgeable about the food you're seeking and making sure that you're upholding good ethical harvesting practices, like making it look like you were never there, making an offering, be it a prayer, water, picking up garbage around the area, just feeling more connected with that food source. And that wild foods are so much more nutrient dense than what we find what we find in, you know, modern grocery stores. And then also to give back to the land, of course, and to cook and eat with good intention. And that means like preparing food, from harvest to table. That whole process is such a holy experience. It's a spiritual experience. It's something you're offering to someone who's a stranger or a guest in your home, or maybe someone who's sick or doesn't have access to good food. You know, when you're preparing things for people, you hold that good intention because the flavor shows up in the food. And then to also eat with good intention. I think that's really important. And that means from the choices you make. You know, I love Mariana's story about harvesting the deer. Even that is a food management practice, right? That we choose what we eat. We vote with our dollar. We vote with our choices, and we vote for that thing to return. We vote for those things to be taken care of, and that it matters to us. And that is really what food sovereignty is. It's the dietary practices of communities that shape the food systems that we are living in. And so, and then also just eating with good intention. Like, does this food make me feel good when I eat it? Does that Arby's 5 for $5 actually taste good? Or is it really salty and it makes me feel terrible? Maybe I shouldn't eat those things. But we are so, you know, it's ingrained in us. My father is retired United States Navy. And so I grew up in this military system, watching how our troops eat, where they just sit at a table and shovel things in like 20 seconds and then get up and move. And that's part of the boot camp experience. But it's also part of like a trauma of removing people from the experience of eating, which is humbling. It's a reminder that we're pitiful humans and we require food to exist. And we should honor that practice and think about it intentionally with good intention.
That's so wonderfully said. And I think, you know, what has come clear from yesterday's discussion and today's is that one, diversity is key, and that two, conviviality, this idea of sharing and eating together and doing it with such good intention is as important as how we grow and produce and distribute and do all the other things that are part of the food supply chain. Vincent, if I can turn back to you, you know, an enormous amount of the work that you do is around education and creating awareness and better understanding, not just about food justice and the work of the Ohlone culture and how important it has been to the place where you live, but it's also creating social justice and what Valerie just said about this idea of food sovereignty. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that.
Absolutely. So we see our food sovereignty tied into our sovereignty as a whole, as a community, as a people. And what I can say about this topic is that consistently, since colonization impacted us, which really wasn't that long ago, just a few lifespans ago, my great-grandmother's great-grandfather was born in an unaffected village that was still unaffected by colonization. So it's just a few lifespans away. But when colonization came, every generation of our family consistently has been working to see our traditional culture made stronger, to see those old ways retained in our lives, and also to make sure that this gets passed on to the next generation. And our elders have been victorious in making sure that our community consistently grows up empowered with these facts of who we come from and where we come from. We also know that there's ways to transcend that pain that came with colonization. When it came here to California, it came in 3 quick waves, with the Spanish coming with the missions, then with a brief period of Mexican colonization in the 1830s to 1840s. And then when Americans came in the 1840s, where there was just extreme hardships that were there for our family. But still, to know that our people transcended those things and that we could still be able to exist here in our home where we've always been, what that does is it shows another story that's often presented to the public outside of our community. To the public outside of our community here in California, there's so many facts that people are just unaware of. But what we want to teach people is to associate our culture not with losses and defeats and sadness and tragedies, to know that sadness and hardships came our way, but also to know that because of that strength of the generations before us, persistence, that's a part of our story. Triumphs are a part of our story. Victories are a part of our story. And to be honest with all of you listening, we don't see ourselves as being a conquered or a defeated people or anything like that. We see ourselves as being a very victorious people, to retain our culture here in our home without ever leaving this place. No generation of our family has. Now, how does that relate to our food sovereignty? To know that we're right here in this exact specific space, to see that, again, those old wounds healed, of now seeing our language, for an example, continue to grow in speakers instead of decline in speakers because of our elders' work to make sure our language was documented and passed on. To be able to see those land stewardship practices that were once banned be able to begin to be renewed. To see babies being named in Chochenyo language for the first time in about 2 generations. To be able to see our family have access to these foods regularly on the table, and to find sometimes innovative ways of having these foods on the table, even when we're in an urban space. Sometimes that means having gardens in community members' homes. Sometimes that means sourcing our watercress or our native blackberries from the farmers markets if we can't gather enough. Sometimes that means finding alternatives and working with communities that are just a little bit outside of the Bay Area, in more central parts of California, to source acorn flour when we can't find enough one year. So those things are important, to be good to the land, never overgather. Make sure as well that we're keeping these cultural practices safe, alive in our lives, and passed on to the next generation, just like all those generations before us did for us. So food sovereignty, justice, it's all a part of this work. Cafe Ohlone became the only Ohlone restaurant in the entire world. And for so long, we've been left out of the culinary scene here in California. That's one thing that's been especially irking as an Indigenous person here in my homeland, is when I hear non-native chefs talk about California cuisine and they associate these things with ingredients that aren't from California. Like they think they can put a persimmon on something or some goat cheese on something, and as long as it's local, then so they say that makes it California cuisine often. But that's not fair, because what that does is it entirely erases us, Indigenous people in California, from that equation. The truth is that California cuisine isn't just whatever you want it to be, but California has several established culinary traditions, and because of the biodiversity of California, it's not a monolith either. The food traditions from here in this part of central coastal California are going to be much different than along the border of Oregon with the Tolowa communities or the Achomawi communities, or much different from Southern California near San Diego and the border of Mexico with the Kumeyaay community. So it's important to know that we're not a monolith, but also that people can't just make California cuisine, or for that sake, the culture of California, whatever they want. But there's established ways of being here. And we're trying to remind the public that the first priority is empowering our community.
Wow, I love that you're dispelling all of these myths. I mean, you mentioned before that often when we hear about Native communities, we hear about, the suffering, the trauma, the poverty, but there's so much success happening, and we need to be reminded of that every day. And also that, California cuisine as it's currently known and sort of this, local, very foodie way is not true California cuisine. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's an amazing point. Mariana, if I can, turn back to you, keeping on this theme of food sovereignty, you have said that agroecology is a tool for social change and environmental change. How does that figure into food sovereignty?
Nosotros usamos la agroecología para llegar a la soberanía alimentaria, ¿sí? Y es lo que queremos dar siempre a conocer acá a los clientes, ¿no? Y también a la nueva gastronomía, cómo tiene que hacer el cambio, porque el modelo actual, el modelo agroindustrial, tiene un fin, digo. No lo vamos a ver, tampoco vamos a ver el cambio, ¿no? Estos a futuras generaciones, pero es el momento de cambiarlo ahora, y nosotros elegimos la agroecología para llegar a la soberanía alimentaria, que es el derecho que tenemos todos los pueblos a la elección del alimento.
So what we try to do is using the agroecology as a tool to change the system that we're living in. Here in our country, the agro system and the way that the industry produce food would lead us to an end. Probably we're not going to see that soon, but we need to generate conscious around, like, the way that you choose the thing that you eat. For us, agroecology is the tool that people can bring to decide to change the future of our planet and the future of our diet and how we eat. It's also part of how sovereign we are. It's important. So for us, our tool that we use here to generate conscious around the impact of the practices that we have as consumers too. So one thing that I wanted to add too is the also coming back to like the traditions of our land and what we've been producing as a country and also as a region in Latin America, is that we always, since colonization, as Vincent brought in our area, we've been producing food for exportation. So that would cause a really big impact on the distribution of the food. Because coming back to the pyramid, I think we first have to talk about if people have access to food, and then if they can choose which food they can eat, right, and which impact it has. So here, in our country, in Argentina, and also in this part of Latin America and the South, the way that we've been producing food historically, it's been a way for exportation, and that remains like less food for the people who live here, and that's a way that we've been introducing different like seeds and different ways of production that being like reducing or remove the soil or having impact on our land. So people here in our country, the distribution of the food it's unequal. So we produce a lot of like soy or grains or meat, but not all the food stays here because we always historically the place that the country has in the global market is thing of exportation. So most of the people here also original communities, they don't have access to food or even drinkable water.
Right.
So first, in order to achieve, for us, we are like a step behind always. For us, in order to achieve the pyramids, and for people, people have to have first the option of having the food itself. So for us here, Catalino is a place where we can communicate about the importance of diversity of the food, the importance of the seasonality, but most of all, stop producing one thing as a country. Stop producing soy as the only thing for exportation. Stop producing meat as the only thing for exportation, because that will kill. That will that would not give people access to land. It will not give people access to the different diversity of food that we have in the area, and that will kill us, as Vincent said, our traditions as well in this part of the continent.
So powerfully said. Thank you both so much. I think this idea of creating better access is key, and also affordability. If people can't buy the food that they have access to, then all of this work is really for naught. But access is really key. I'm wondering if we can now turn back to Vincent and Valerie and bring up the USA pyramid, the USA cultural pyramid. And I want to get your thoughts a little bit about, how tools like this and tools like that Valerie has created, and the important education that Vincent is doing. How do we make sure that more research is done around the cultural identity and importance of foods? I mean, Valerie, you've been doing this research your whole career, and now it's getting more and more attention. How can we encourage that more of this kind of research and awareness building happens?
I think actually engaging with the communities in meaningful ways, and right now in our country, who sets these guidelines, and then where does that information come from? Mm-hmm. It's really like vague and ominous, and honestly, when it's difficult, I understand, for the federal government to have a relationship. These federal feeding programs develop these nutrient guidelines, and that's what dictates what comes out in the food distribution program on Indian reservations, to SNAP recipients, to WIC. All of the federal feeding programs are set by these guidelines, so they're pretty critical to get right. And I understand it's really difficult to have access to the communities that they're meant to serve, to have these kinds of conversations. But there are a lot of, like, for tribal communities, there are a lot of Native-led organizations who are grassroots efforts, who have like their fingers on the pulse of the people that they serve, and they are underfunded, and they're invisible sometimes. We have, leaning into them as partners who can, like, when COVID happened, all of us food systems workers were also essential workers on the back end of the scenes, trying to make sure that tribal communities who are food insecure in this country got food. And there was a lot of donations. Donations have increased 100-fold from, local farmers to tribal communities. That's incredible. And those distributions happen not because we have this amazing food infrastructure system in our country, but because we had Native-led organizations who knew how to get food to the people they serve. And so leaning into them is kind of critical to be able to get true consultation from these communities, and not just putting all of that on the federal government or whoever out there developing these dietary guidelines. I think that's really important, and not just to hear from, we can start with right now, NAF, I'm working on a food hunger survey, because there's actually no national measure of Native American food insecurity and hunger in this country. Right now, the census, if you check the Native American box, you're automatically by their algorithm pushed into other races. And that's how it's being interpreted on the back end. So we can't even tell our Native farmers how much food they should produce to be able to feed their people. That is not true for other races. And so I think we can do a better job at basic research and empower Native led organizations and even spaces like what Vincent is supporting, to be able to do this work and really tell a full picture and story about access to food, the issues people have. We know that COVID has illuminated all these gaps in our system, and that infrastructure is so necessary for everybody's health, not just for ours. But if you were to lean into just Indian country, you'd be able to get this accomplished. We come from a long line of people who have organized their lives around food for a long time, and we have a lot of good insight to offer in being a part of the solution.
Well, hopefully one of the things that COVID has done is made us realize that in a bigger way, that we need to build these partnerships and lean in, as you said so eloquently, to Native communities to make sure that they are part of these processes from the very beginning, that it's not something they just receive later on, that they are involved from the very beginning. Vincent, would you like to comment as well?
I really appreciate what Valerie just said, and there was a lot of points that she just made. I mean, everything you just said was, I feel like it's very easy to identify with, understanding that this food pyramid that so many of us grew up with here in the United States. I grew up as a child in the 90s, and we saw the conventional American food pyramid of foods that were supposedly the healthiest for our bodies. But this one-size-fits-all food pyramid, that the one that was commonplace throughout about 2009 or 10, before there started to be some changes to that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And an example of this is many people in our community, including myself, have intolerances to dairy, for an example. And right there on the standard conventional American food pyramid growing up, dairy was one of the most common and recommended foods to eat. Now, when we look at that and we look at this one size fits all, you got to think of really who's, as was just being mentioned, who's really behind that. Is that a person of color? Is that a indigenous people, or is that made for a white audience of people whose food that might work better with their bodies? And instead, what I like to think of is to understand that, again, like how we said California, traditional world here in California isn't a monolith, that in the United States today, that this is a very cosmopolitan and multicultural place, and different diets work for different people. Now, if we were able to have a food pyramid that shows our traditional diet, acorn would be at the top of that, for an example. And then that would be followed with all of our other traditional foods. Now, being able to understand that, and understand that certain foods work better with our bodies, it's important also because we believe that when our bodies are at their best capacity, when we're eating foods that are good for us, that aren't making us feel sick or tired or bloated or anything like that, that we're at our best capacity. And when our minds are cleared and our bodies are full of traditional foods, that allows us to be more capable in other ways as well. It allows us to be able to see the injustice that we're seeing and find ways to respond to that, and ways that maybe we can if we're tired, from foods that are making our bodies tired. The foods that the government imposed on our communities, I'm going to be very honest, I don't feel like those foods were imposed for a reason, to be able to hold our people down. Things like white flour, things like dairy, things like commodity cheese, these foods that were imposed, they led to things like diabetes, high blood pressure, that our community is still grappling with, still overcoming from today. But by looking at our ancestors' knowledge and the old ways as being our guiding force, we can see that our diet for us, specifically here in California, here in this part of California, that this is what's best for our bodies. And even to take a look at this in another way as well, there's even certain indigenous foods that are indigenous to other people that our community responded badly to when they were first introduced, like corn, for an example. Sweet corn, it's not something that's native here to California. And when it was introduced, it caused blood sugar to rise, and often that led to some health issues that are there too. And so, again, it's just to show, that there's always different ways of being, different ways of eating, And we want to be able to promote and elevate what's best for us in our bodies, and also to be aware that that's true for other people all around the world as well. And that's something that's really beautiful at the same time, is that ability to have all these different ways of existing and eating.
Absolutely. It goes back to that wonderful diversity of our agrobiodiversity in the world. It's just beautiful, and we've forgotten so much of it. So really reviving it, and the important work that you are all doing is so important. And I think the strength of both the double pyramid and the cultural pyramids that have been created is that they emphasize that there's no one size fits all diet. Not, we don't have to have, meat and a starch and vegetable on our plates, that it can be very varied and diverse, as we said before. I hate to cut this conversation short. This has been such a wonderful almost hour now, and I really appreciate all of you participating and getting up very, very early in some cases to join us. A reminder that this episode will also appear on our podcast, Food Talk with Danielle Nierenberg. And again, please share this discussion and continue the conversation using the hashtag Double Pyramid. And I hope folks will join us at 9 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, when we'll be talking to chefs from the Mediterranean and Nordic regions of the world. Vincent, Valerie, Mariana, Daniela, please stay safe and well. And thank you for all of the work that you do.
Thank you.
Gracias.